Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're sitting down today with the CEO of CipherTrace, Dave Jevans. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dave.
Justin, it's great to be talking with you.
Could you discuss a little bit about what CipherTrace does and how you got the idea for joining this niche within the overall blockchain or Bitcoin industry?
Sure. I got into cryptocurrencies long before Bitcoin. I was a cipher punk back in 99, 2000. I got to meet some of the guys from Zero Knowledge Systems, DigiCash, eGold. So I've been in the search for a viable cryptocurrency for about 8 or 9 years before Bitcoin came along. And about 2011, when I really got clued into the white paper and everything, I was like, this is the one. So really got interested in it then. But, I was running a few companies and involved in the security and crypto industry. So it took me a few years to really dive into it. But, we decided, my friends and I, just like, this is really the space. Bitcoin's the one. And then cryptocurrency and broader. We figured it out here as far as proof of work and the whole distributed system. So we got into it that way. And about 2015, 2016, we realized that there was an opportunity in helping cryptocurrencies become very legitimate, because we believed in it for a long time as being global currency, freedom of currency. And we just wanted to deal with the side of, unfortunately, how we build that interface with government and regulations, and how we create the optimum privacy for people, yet the compliance with government regulations, because it's going to have to be done. And so we decided to create a company that bridges that gap, which is find the bad guys and protect everyone else.
Now, it's interesting because I think there was a little bit of pushback on this blockchain analytics industry, especially based on the early ethos of the Bitcoin industry. But before I get into that, I'm kind of curious if you could elaborate upon what it was like as a cypherpunk pre-Bitcoin.
Oh, so that was once a month. We'd have Chinese food dinner at a Chinese restaurant on a Tuesday night, and get all the cypherpunk guys in the Bay Area together and really discuss about how to build cryptocurrencies, how to convert them into fiat, which was a big challenge. Because I think that the core technology existed based on a lot of David Chaum's work, and even, believe it or not, MasterCard's work on Mondex was a lot about digital currencies. So there's been a lot of work around this space, but the core issue was, how do you get it to the banking industry? How do you preserve anonymity and privacy around it? So they'd be very enjoyable meetings, once a month, and then people would propose things. I mean, Nick Szabo was also working on his smart contract work, which he'd been working on for 4 or 5 years before that time, which ended up being, some of the seminal work that really underpins Ethereum and some of the smart contract things. So it was a very interesting, dynamic time of people that were trying to figure out how to build smart contract based distributed currencies, but how do you get it into the banking system? And I think that's one of the interesting things that Bitcoin solved with their POW algorithm, their whole incentives on miners, and then how you distribute the banking infrastructure across exchanges rather than centralized interfaces to the banks.
Could you talk about some of the what you found researching the use of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin by the quote bad guys, as you put it?
Well, I think, let's face it, any new technology is going to get used by people who are doing interesting things that may not be socially acceptable. So we saw how videotapes and was used by the porn industry initially, and that got it before it really took off in the movie industry. I think the same is true on the internet video streaming side before Netflix and, Apple's movie systems. I think the same was true of cryptocurrencies. There was a lot of innovators who just loved the idea of being able to move money across the world freely, transparently. It was a freedom, moment. Just like, wow, we can do this, and it actually worked. And then, some bad guys came in and were like, okay, great. Like, let's move, money across for drugs, weapons, money laundering, etc. And that happened for a while because the industry didn't, the industry was new. It was innovators. It was technical people. It was visionaries. Nobody was thinking about how bad guys were going to do it or what the regulatory issues were going to be. I mean, sure, some people thought about bad guys, but there was no thought about what was going to happen here. And so that there was some abuse of the system at the beginning, but if you look at it over time, over the last, say, 7-8 years, the use of criminals for Bitcoin has declined, and other currencies, Ethereum and others, has really declined quite a bit as a percentage. So we can attribute it to the growth of the cryptocurrency ecosystem and controls around, let's just not let people who are, doing bad stuff just abuse the system.
So from what I understand, and the way that law enforcement has long approached Bitcoin is looking at the on ramps and off ramps from crypto. And I'm an incorporated business, and I read my incorporation document, and it makes clear that I have to report any sort of illegal activity conducted around my business or via my business, or attempted illegal activities that are conducted through my business. Could you kind of elaborate on that, and just furthermore about how the space has evolved and the reasons for it evolving away from this paradigm that it is used for criminal activity?
Yeah, I'd say that 99.8% of cryptocurrency is used for legitimate activities. So it's actually safer to use crypto, if you think about it, than it is to look at cash transactions, or even, broad-based money laundering from banks that don't do any control. So I think the evolution of it is really like a learning exercise for regulators, for law enforcement, that cryptocurrency is really, at the end of the day, a force for good and a way to get a global market involved, whether it's trading or financial exchange, and that there's better controls which still preserve people's privacy and don't require a surveillance state, but still can provide assistance when something goes wrong.
That's really interesting. I'm kind of curious. Could you talk about the way you sort of sit maybe at this cross section between law enforcement and cryptocurrency blockchain entrepreneurs? Would you mind discussing being in that position, what it's like, maybe how law enforcement views cryptocurrency and Bitcoin? I mean, that's kind of a general question, but as well as the way the community has kind of stepped up and recognized the need to sort of do our best to eliminate like real and legitimate threats.
Yeah, and I think that your question, Justin, needs to be a little bit expanded to how governments view it, not just law enforcement, because law enforcement's, a piece of government. But think about like securities regulation, like the SEC, for example, in the United States, and fraudulent ICOs. So it's broader than just law enforcement. But I would say that I think that, the industry has really done a great job in stepping up, in understanding regulations, and engaging with the regulatory side of the house. Say that the regulatory side, just on a an optimistic side, was really generated because there have been many frauds over the last 100 years, whether they're fraudulent companies, Ponzi schemes, etc. These regulations were developed in response to criminal activity that ripped people off. And so they're not, in my opinion, they weren't developed capriciously. They're not developed to spy on people. They were developed to help people. Now, I think the understanding around it has evolved quite a bit as far as how the crypto industry operates, how it really provides great financial freedom, how it actually can provide better security for individuals and these agencies. So that's an effort that needs to continue, which is bring it together to try to create a harmonious environment where we can continue to grow crypto, continue to protect privacy, but also really grow it, but deal with these issues. So for example, you'll have somebody say, "Oh, I think it's terrible that the government can track my transactions." Well, anyone can track your transactions with blockchain. And yet when their stuff gets stolen, what's the first thing they do? Hey, help me get my Bitcoin or Ethereum back. So there's an interesting balance. It's a dynamic balance. I can't say that I have an answer to it. It's an interesting social dynamic around, hey, we want financial freedom. We want to be able to control our assets. And you perfectly can, right? Manage your own keys. You manage your own currency. Go for it. But this other dynamic of, I had an investment in crypto and then someone stole it because I was stupid, or I gave them my password, or my exchange got hacked, and please help me. So, the social dynamic is out there. It's real. So these are the areas that we work in. Challenging.
What do you think law enforcement, specifically officers, should know about something like Bitcoin? So, for instance, I saw an article recently in the UK that they're training officers about Bitcoin. That their policing has kind of evolved into the digital sphere in some ways, unlike prior to sort of the digital revolution we've seen. Could you discuss what just a law enforcement officer who's interested in staying up to date on the changing threats should know?
Sure. So the first thing that I think every listener should understand is that law enforcement is not in the business of finding out your transactions. Law enforcement is in the business of responding to people who complain that their money got stolen or that they were defrauded. That's the first thing to understand. There is nobody in law enforcement that has a budget to spy on you or to look at your stuff. So now we look at what does law enforcement need to know? Most law enforcement agencies barely can keep up with their existing cases. So, people broke into my house, my husband or wife got divorced from me and took all my money, somebody defrauded me in my company, somebody, raped me, all these horrible things. So that's the first thing. And then I think on the training side, it's really about what do they need to understand? So what is cryptocurrency? How does Bitcoin is a good start. I would suggest you start with Bitcoin and then try to educate them on Ethereum and other things, which are much more complicated than they can understand. But I start with Bitcoin as a good primer, which is, what is it? How's it generated? Who can store it? How do cryptocurrency wallets work? What about tracing? So how do UTXOs work? So unspent transaction outputs, how can you trace it? How can you use open source tools to do an investigation? And even more basic, what does a Bitcoin wallet look like if you find it on a person's computer or on a piece of paper or on a hardware wallet? Like, what is a treasure? What is a ledger? What do those things look like? So it's very basic for the most part.
Now, how about for like the Bitcoin community in particular? Now, we've learned so much about the true nature of Bitcoin transparency since it first kind of burst onto the scene and people kind of saw it as providing some sort level of privacy. And that's kind of been backtracked from as we've learned about the nature of a blockchain. But early on, an ethos in this community was very adamant about reserving privacy, about keeping governments and law enforcement out of their digital wallet. Could you describe like this gray area in which like these technologies could be used for crimes and how, I think in my opinion, like law enforcement in particular, like they're not going after law abiding Bitcoin users. There's a lot of people that are using Bitcoin for illegitimate activities. A lot of the local Bitcoins arrests that I've seen over the years, for instance, are because an individual agreed to kind of be party to a crime, whether that be buying Bitcoins that were um, acquired due to selling stolen personal data or otherwise. Could you talk to like the Bitcoin community about how law enforcement isn't out to get them, but rather oftentimes kind of secure these systems or secure kind of the nation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in general, law enforcement is only about cases that somebody lost something, somebody was injured, they had $50,000 of Bitcoin stolen or what have you. They don't have time to deal with anything else. There's no deep investigation other than if it's child exploitation, weapons trafficking, or drugs trafficking. Basically, nobody has any time to do anything. So if you're not involved in those markets, don't worry. Now, I think on the other side, I mean, just basically, it was my experience in certainly North America, South America, and Europe. Governments are okay to promote cryptocurrencies and to let it flourish and to understand that it's an innovation aspect of currencies, and cryptocurrencies are one of the fastest growing innovation vectors we've seen since the invention of the credit card and the debit card in 1958, when we saw Visa come about 56, 58, and then we saw MasterCard, and that's the biggest innovation we've seen in payments. So that was before our lifetimes. And now we're seeing the next big innovation in payments technology since the invention of the credit card. I don't see governments trying to stop it. They're looking to basically foster innovation, but have compliance with the regulations that they have already put in place based on 50, 60, 70 years of looking at it. So I think generally, I feel that the space has got a quite open field for it. We should take advantage of it. Let's work on the regulatory compliance areas to make sure that we can convince these regulators that we're compliant. But yeah, I think there's a huge innovation opportunity here, and it continues. And they recognize it, and I think law enforcement has their own views on it, but it's not a big deal. They basically respond that nobody's doing much proactive. It's really responding to people who got ripped off or known criminals.
What are some of the biggest challenges that CipherTrace faces in 2020 when it comes to Bitcoin?
On Bitcoin side, I don't think we have a lot of challenges. We're all
Perhaps,
investors in Bitcoin. We're super bullish. We're all on the same side of everyone else. We want Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to grow and become more than more than what it is in the currency space. So let me give you this statistic. So I did some investigation. I looked at all credit card transactions in 2019. So MasterCard, Visa, Amex, about 14 trillion. If you look at all on-chain transactions across Bitcoin, Ethereum, and other currencies, you're about a 1 trillion. So it took 50 years for credit cards to get to 14 trillion. It's taken 10 years for cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin being the leader, but to get to 1 trillion. It's pretty impressive. So I'm very bullish on space.
so I read that you lost perhaps some funds in Mt. Gox or the other
Yeah,
CipherTrace founders. That's on the CipherTrace website. What was that experience
yeah,
like?
crappy. What are you going to
Yeah.
do? I mean, you lose it. That means, what, we're going to wait like 5 years, 6 years to get it back? Yeah, crappy. That was part of that was a little bit of the motivation, We started mining in 2011. And then when, you lose stuff at Mt. Gox and things, then you get a little bit like, wait, I'd like to get my money back, please.
Have you been a part of that process to regain funds? That's still ongoing, I believe.
We have. We're not the main, contractor to do that. There's been some contracts issued to do that. Certainly we've looked at it for ourselves, but yeah, we're not the main contractor on that.
What about currencies, cryptocurrencies such as Monero, Zcash, Dash, which I believe were just subjects of some legislation in Japan? These pretend to provide a little more privacy for the users or participants in that network. Are these unique challenges for a firm such as yours?
Well, certainly they're going to be challenging. I think that the Japanese approach is an approach. I think it's a little heavy-handed to be able to blacklist currencies. I think that's not very scalable because there's going to be more and more currencies that focus on these areas. I think it's perfectly appropriate for people to be able to have person-to-person exchanges of currency that are private. In fact, I think it's important for democracy and for the global economy that people can do P2P transactions within certain limits that are absolutely private. So I'm a big fan of them. I also recognize that they have to be compliant to be able to transact within the fiat currency world. And we've been working with the Monero team, the Zcash team on integrating into some of the emerging regulations, like what we call the travel rule, which is a global standard that is emerging around countries on exchanging buyer and seller, or rather sender and beneficiary information. And we believe that that's important. And we've had a very good interaction with the Monero team and with the Zcash team. So there's, I think those technologies are absolutely important to keep running, very important for creating a financial democracy. But we also have to make sure that the on-ramps and off-ramps are compliant. And we've had very good response from the community.
Could you discuss a little further the travel rule for those who are not aware of what it is, and then also, as far as you can, insofar as you can, how you're working with Zcash and Monero teams?
So Zcash and Monero teams, you can find it on trissa.io, triso.io, trissa.io, that's travel rule information sharing architecture, trissa.io. That is an effort to comply with global standards around exchanging information of who is sending money to who is receiving money. Today, that is oriented around exchanges, custodial wallets, etc. So what they call virtual asset service providers, or VASPs. So I think every listener should understand what a VASP is, because you're going to hear it more and more. So that's a virtual assets service provider. So a company that is involved in crypto assets and is a company, not an individual. So our interaction with them has been very good on how do we integrate Monero and Zcash into those types of transactions, but yet allow person-to-person transactions to be private. And then, I'm sorry, you had a first question.
The travel rule. Could you describe
Oh
what
yeah.
that is?
So the travel rule is it's basically the requirement for a virtual asset service provider. So think about it as an exchange or a hosted wallet to send your name, your account number to the person you send the cryptocurrency to, if they are also an exchange. So this is sending money from one exchange to another will require the sending of your name as registered in your account, some information about you, an account number, to the receiving exchange, and they will have to send back confirmation, including beneficiary information. So you're actually supposed to send your name and the beneficiary information, the person you're sending it to. This is what travel rule is, which is if you send from one virtual asset service provider, VASP, which is an exchange, hosted wallet, etc., to another, they're going to require that the name and other account information and a beneficiary is sent between each other.
Could you discuss Trissa a little bit more in depth as well? I see that's like particularly focused on the virtual asset industry.
Trissa is a travel information sharing architecture organization. We've created as an open source organization. We would encourage every listener to get involved in it. You can get involved at trissa.io, trisa.io, trissa.io. It's an open source project. It's on GitHub. This is a way to facilitate this information exchange, to have a directory of registered virtual asset service providers. We'd like to get people involved who want to work on the code, but preserve user privacy, to think about how the directory structure works. Because at the end of the day, the directory service is one of the biggest issues. How do you identify who's an exchange, who isn't an exchange, who's a DeFi provider, who isn't, who's a private wallet? You know, we'd like to make sure that we keep private hosted wallets private. So everyone who can get involved in this, we'd love to have you involved. We have conference calls every Thursday, and we have a GitHub on that. So we'd love to get more involvement from the privacy community, from the Bitcoin community, from the VASP community, to really chip in on, one, how this thing's going to work, because regulators are regulators and it's going to happen. And two, how do we make sure that we protect the core values and benefits of crypto?
What's next for CipherTrace?
Well, we're doing a lot of this advocacy around privacy, but also trying to support regulatory stuff and being realistic. If we work with regulators, and I mean, what they're going to do is what they're going to do. So we want to protect cryptocurrency and drive it to be global. What's next for us? We're working with financial institutions around the world to try to make sure that they provide banking on-ramps and off-ramps to cryptocurrency companies so that we're able to make sure that crypto becomes, as big as MasterCard, as big as Visa, and as widely acceptable.
On a macro scale, like which, I guess, regulators or representatives have been easiest to work with or most reasonable when it comes to cryptocurrency and this new technology?
This will surprise you. Every regulator we've spoken to is smarter than you think, nicer than you think, and really wants to advance this. I've not met with a regulator once who doesn't want to see cryptocurrency and innovation move into financial services, move into disrupting, sending, giving someone $20 bill and getting 3 paper bills and 20 cents back in metal. They'll give you COVID. I've not seen anyone in the space against it. They're smarter, they're nicer, and they're more dedicated than you would think. So we've not had a nasty reception anywhere. I would say certainly if you look at leadership in the space, won't be a surprise. The United States has been, leading in the industry as far as, or in the regulatory side of things, I suppose, and trying to make their regulations, be conformed to by other countries. But yeah, I've yet to meet a regulator who's got some hardline issue. People are really in discovery mode. I've not met anyone who says no way crypto. I think we're going to sit here 10, 20 years from now and just go like crypto, duh. It took over, fiat. But that's just what I see.
That is surprising. Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us today, Dave. We've spoken with Dave Jevans, the CEO of CipherTrace, and thank you everyone for listening. We really appreciate it.